You are standing in the cold stone halls of Westminster Abbey. The year is 1396. Your breath turns white in the autumn air as torches flicker against towering Gothic arches. The great oak doors creak open, and the wedding procession enters. At first, you see the king, Richard II of England, tall, regal, 29 years old, his golden hair gleaming in the light. But then your eyes fall to the figure beside him, a little girl, barely reaching his elbow, her hand swallowed by his gloved palm, pearls dragging heavy against her small head. She is 6 years old, and tonight she will be crowned Queen of England. How could this be possible? How could the fate of nations rest on the shoulders of a child who still plays with dolls? This was never meant to be a love story. It was a political masterpiece. A dark bargain meant to buy peace in a war-torn world. Behind this marriage lies betrayal, survival, and forgotten humanity. Tell me in the comments, where in the world are you watching from? And if you want to uncover more of these hidden, forbidden stories of history, make sure to subscribe. Isabella of Valois was born on November 9th, 1389, within the grand walls of the Louvre Palace in Paris. The palace itself was a symbol of French majesty, its high towers overlooking the Seine, its chambers filled with velvet drapes and golden candlelight. Yet behind this display of power, her arrival came into a world already fractured by instability, fear, and whispers of madness. Her father was Charles VI of France, remembered by history as Charles the Mad. At times, he could be a capable monarch, speaking wisely to his advisors and riding at the head of his armies with regal dignity. But at other times, he collapsed into terrifying delusions. He claimed he was made of glass and dared not move for fear of shattering into pieces. He forgot his own name, fled his chambers screaming of assassins, or refused to bathe for months, convinced that water was poison. To courtiers and servants, these episodes were horrifying. To his children, they were incomprehensible. For Isabella, even as an infant, the palace air carried tension. Joy could transform into terror within a single heartbeat. Her mother, Isabel of Bavaria, was beautiful, clever, and ruthlessly ambitious. Unlike her husband, she was steady, calculating, and keenly aware of her children's value. She did not cradle Isabella with the tenderness of a doting parent. She studied her with the eyes of a strategist. This daughter, with her dark hair and noble blood, could one day be exchanged like a jewel across the chessboard of Europe. To Isabel, her children were assets, living tokens to be traded for alliances, land, or peace. Isabella's earliest years were shaped by this uneasy balance. In the mornings, she might be carried through sunlit courtyards, her father lucid enough to bounce her on his knee, laughing as he scattered coins for the servants. But by night, the same man might cower in a corner, trembling at unseen enemies, while guards rushed to hide the royal children away. For a little girl, the line between safety and fear was as fragile as her father's mind. The French kingdom itself reflected this fragility. The 100 Years' War with England had already consumed decades, draining treasuries, devastating villages, and leaving entire regions in ruin. Famine lingered like a shadow, banditry plagued the roads, and the nobility schemed endlessly in Parisian courts. To be born into royalty was not a promise of stability. It was an initiation into danger, and for Isabella, it meant her life was never her own. From the start, she was watched not only by nurses and tutors, but also by diplomats who speculated on her worth. Her mother made sure the child was dressed in silks, taught the gestures of nobility, and prepared to smile on command. Even before she could speak, Isabella was more symbol than daughter, a bargaining chip in the endless struggle between kingdoms. Yet within those dark corridors of power, Isabella's presence also carried a fragile hope. For all her father's madness and her mother's ambition, she was a child, innocent, curious, and destined to be drawn into the violent theater of European politics. In her cries, in her first steps across the echoing marble floors of the Louvre, lay the seeds of a story that would one day span 2 crowns, 2 marriages, and a legacy carved out of tragedy. The Louvre Palace glittered with jewels and banners, its banquet halls echoing with the sounds of music, laughter, and courtly games. To an outsider, it was a fortress of wealth, a shining heart of the French kingdom. But to little Isabella, the palace was also a labyrinth of shadows. Behind the painted ceilings and gilded walls lurked fear, a fear that grew sharper each time her father, King Charles VI, fell into one of his dark episodes. She learned early that silence was survival. One moment, Charles might stride through the corridors in regal command, his robes flowing, his voice steady and warm as he called for his daughter. He would scoop Isabella into his arms, pressing a kiss onto her forehead, promising her sweets or toys from faraway lands. But the next moment, the same man would collapse into paranoia, screaming that assassins stalked the halls. Once he clutched at his chest, shouting that his body was made of glass, and begged everyone not to touch him for fear of shattering. On those days, servants rushed the children away. Isabella, wide-eyed, would cling to her nurse's skirts, her small heart racing as she heard the king's cries echo down the marble corridors. Her mother, Isabel of Bavaria, reacted very differently. To her, Charles's madness was not merely tragedy, it was opportunity. The queen positioned herself as the true power of France, gathering allies, manipulating factions, and carefully shaping her children's roles in the kingdom's future. She would glance at Isabella, not with affection, but with calculation. The girl's beauty, her royal blood, her very existence, these were weapons. To Isabel, her daughter was destined not for childhood, but for politics. Thus, Isabella grew up in two worlds at once, the glittering surface of royal splendor and the trembling darkness beneath it. She played among tapestries and golden toys, yet every game was shadowed by whispers of her father's instability and her mother's ambitions. She saw noblemen bow deeply in public, but sneer in private. She watched her mother smile in the council chamber, only to hear rumors that those same smiles masked betrayal. For a child, it might have been overwhelming. And yet, these contradictions became Isabella's silent tutors. She learned to observe quietly, to read faces, to sense when danger lurked beneath polished words. She discovered that power was fragile, alliances brittle, and that survival often depended not on strength, but on caution. Every episode of her father's madness, every cold appraisal in her mother's eyes, carved something deeper into Isabella's spirit. Where another child might have broken, she absorbed the lessons of fear and ambition, hardening them into resilience. She came to understand, even before she reached her teens, that her life would not belong to her. It would belong to France, to politics, to the treaties her hand could sign, and the peace her presence could symbolize. In the grand palace of the Louvre, Isabella's childhood was not a time of innocence, but an apprenticeship in survival. The laughter of servants, the cries of her father, the careful maneuverings of her mother, all of it built the foundation of the woman she would become. Cautious, intelligent, and unyielding in the face of storms yet to come. By the time Isabella was old enough to understand the whispers of the court, France and England had been locked in war for more than 60 years. The 100 Years' War had begun as a dispute over the French crown, but it had grown into something far greater, a war of pride, land, and identity that drained both kingdoms like a wound that refused to heal. In France, entire villages lay in ashes. Fields once rich with grain had become graveyards of scorched earth. Farmers abandoned their homes, fleeing from English raids or the roaming bands of mercenaries who pillaged countryside estates. Hunger gnawed at peasants and nobles alike. Even in Paris, where the Louvre shimmered with jewels and pageantry, the air was heavy with unease. Behind the walls of feasting halls, the kingdom bled. England was little better. Its nobles had poured fortunes into endless campaigns across the Channel. Coffers were nearly empty, and the once proud armies were weary. The people longed for peace, but kings rarely bowed to such desires without gain. It was in this fragile landscape that Isabella's name began to surface in the negotiations whispered behind closed doors. She was only a child, but in her small frame lay the possibility of ending a war that had scarred generations. A marriage alliance. France would offer its young princess to Richard II of England in exchange for peace. To the diplomats, it was a brilliant solution. The union would not only bring a truce of nearly 3 decades, but also bind the two crowns together in a way no treaty of ink and parchment could. A child bride, they argued, was not a weakness, but a symbol. Isabella would grow up in the English court, molded into its customs, speaking its tongue, bridging two nations with her very being. By the time she reached womanhood, she would embody the peace so desperately needed, but to those who knew the girl, the calculation felt colder. Isabella was only 6 years old, still playing with dolls, her world limited to tutors and courtyards. She could not yet read the scriptures her father's clerics recited, yet already her future was being carved onto parchment by men she had never met. She was not a daughter, not even a child in their eyes. She was a treaty, a living coin to be exchanged across a chessboard drenched in blood. Her mother, Isabel of Bavaria, saw opportunity in the proposal. A daughter on the throne of England meant influence, leverage, and power, stretching across the Channel. Her father, drifting in and out of sanity, had no voice strong enough to oppose or consent. And so, Isabella's fate was sealed by politics, not by love or family. As war-torn France staggered under the weight of exhaustion and England sought to refill its coffers, the idea of a child queen no longer seemed unthinkable. It seemed necessary. In the gilded halls of Paris, the little princess was quietly prepared, her hair braided with pearls, her tutors pressing English phrases into her memory, while outside, soldiers buried their dead. Isabella had been born into shadows. Now she was about to be cast into a stage far darker, where childhood ended the moment politics claimed her as its prize. In 1394, Richard II of England lost the one person who had softened the edges of his troubled reign, Queen Anne of Bohemia. She had been gentle, beloved by the people, and, more importantly, a true companion to Richard in a world of treachery and suspicion. Her sudden death from plague devastated him. For months, the king wandered the halls of his palaces like a shadow, draped in mourning black, ordering entire towns where Anne had once stayed to be razed in grief. Yet grief could not disguise a far more dangerous reality. Richard had no heir. An English king without a successor was a kingdom balanced on a knife's edge. His advisors urged him to remarry quickly, but Richard resisted. To replace Anne felt like betrayal. Still, the crown was not built on sentiment, and the nobles reminded him that dynasties did not survive on memory. They survived on bloodlines. It was then that emissaries from France crossed the Channel with an audacious proposal. They offered Richard peace in the form of a child. Isabella of Valois, eldest daughter of Charles VI, and Isabel of Bavaria would be given as his bride. With her would come a dowry of 800,000 francs, a staggering sum capable of replenishing England's drained treasury, and a truce of 28 years, long enough for an entire generation to grow up without the shadow of war. The offer stunned Richard's council. On parchment, it was dazzling. Gold to refill coffers, peace to stabilize borders, and a royal bride to strengthen the king's legitimacy. But the ink also dripped with unease. Isabella was only 6 years old. Even in an age where political marriages often paired young brides with older kings, this was extraordinary. Most noble girls were wed in their early teens, not their infancy. To parade a child as queen risked scandal, ridicule, even outrage among the English nobility. Debates raged in Westminster. Some lords saw wisdom in the proposal, arguing that peace and money outweighed any whispers of impropriety. Others fumed that Richard was degrading the English crown, lowering it to the level of mockery. Why, they asked, should the realm bow to France by accepting a child bride? Was this not weakness dressed as diplomacy? And yet Richard himself listened quietly, his thoughts wandering not to politics, but to the tiny portrait of Isabella sent by the French ambassadors. In the miniature painting, her features were delicate, her dark eyes wide with innocence. She was not a bride in the king's imagination. She was a child who needed protection. Some at court whispered that Richard, who had never fathered a son or daughter, saw in Isabella a strange chance. Not just to secure peace, but to play the role of guardian, almost of father. For weeks, negotiations twisted across the Channel. Every clause was debated. Isabella's upbringing in England, her French attendants, the promise that the marriage would remain unconsummated until she reached maturity. It was diplomacy written in human lives, and Isabella, still playing with dolls in Paris, had no voice in it. In the end, politics triumphed over hesitation. The council bent to Richard's will. The child would come to England, not as a girl, but as a queen. On the last day of October, 1396, the winds off the Channel carried both the chill of autumn and the weight of history. At Calais, a fortress city under English control on French soil, the stage was set for a union that was meant to bind two nations together. The great hall of Calais Castle had been draped in banners of lilies and lions, symbols of France and England interwoven for the first time in decades. Into this hall walked Isabella of Valois, a girl of just 7 years. Her gown of cloth of gold was so heavy with pearls and embroidery that she needed help to move, each step a struggle beneath the weight of her future. Behind her trailed French ladies-in-waiting, whispering encouragement. But their words could not erase the strangeness of the moment. Isabella's wide eyes scanned the assembled nobles, men with stern faces, jeweled collars, and watchful gazes, before landing on the tall figure awaiting her at the altar. Richard II, King of England, 29 years old, dressed in velvet trimmed with ermine, his hair glinting in the torchlight. The contrast was stark, a monarch in his prime, and a child barely old enough to understand the ceremony unfolding. When Richard knelt to her level to exchange rings, witnesses noted the gentleness in his manner. He lifted her chin with a gloved hand so she would not have to crane her neck, and spoke his vows in a voice that carried more tenderness than triumph. Chroniclers later remarked that this was no lecherous act, no grotesque violation of innocence. Instead, it was a political ritual, solemn and deliberate, with Richard treating his tiny bride more like a daughter than a wife. The courtiers looked on with mixed expressions, some relieved, others skeptical. For the French envoys, the sight of Isabella becoming Queen of England marked the successful sealing of a truce that had eluded warriors for generations. For the English lords, it was harder to swallow. The image of their king bound to a child stirred unease, and more than one whispered whether this peace had been bought at too high a cost. Isabella herself seemed bewildered, her small hands clutching the ring that dwarfed her finger. She repeated the words she had been taught, her French accent thick, her voice uncertain but clear. When the vows ended and the blessing was given, the child from Paris was no longer merely a princess. She was now Queen of England. Outside, cannons fired in celebration, trumpets blared across Calais, announcing to the world that the blood-soaked rivalry between England and France was, at least for now, put aside. The people cheered, though some wondered how long such peace could truly last. That night, feasts filled the halls with wine, song, and laughter. Yet amid the revelry, Isabella sat quietly beside her new husband, barely touching her food, her small feet swinging above the floor. She could not know it then, but this moment was the threshold of a life that would carry her far from childhood into a destiny carved by war, diplomacy, and survival. A year after the quiet ceremony at Calais, the child bride was brought across the Channel to the heart of England. It was October 1397 when London prepared to see its new queen for the first time. Word had spread for months, whispers of the French princess, barely more than a child, who had been given as the price of peace. Curiosity swelled into obsession, and on the day of her coronation, the streets overflowed with people desperate for a glimpse. Isabella's litter moved slowly through the city, draped in crimson and gold. English roses and French fleur-de-lis were embroidered into the canopy above her, a living emblem of two kingdoms bound together. Beneath the canopy sat the 7-year-old queen, her face pale but composed, her small hands folded carefully in her lap as she had been instructed. Around her, nobles shouted blessings, though some muttered disapproval under their breath. Chroniclers recorded that the crowds pressed so tightly to see the child that several were crushed to death in the surge, a grim reminder of how spectacle could devour its own audience. When Isabella finally entered Westminster Abbey, she was clothed in robes specially tailored to fit her tiny frame, lined with fur and trimmed with jewels. A crown, crafted smaller than any before, was lowered onto her head. From the high altar, Richard II watched with solemn pride, his gaze fixed not on a political pawn, but on a child he seemed determined to protect. The ceremony itself unfolded with the full grandeur of medieval pageantry. Trumpets blared, choirs sang, and candles burned by the thousands, their flames glittering off golden chalices and jeweled reliquaries. Yet amid all this splendor, it was the child's composure that captured attention. Isabella repeated the oaths in her halting English, her voice fragile but steady, Courtiers later marveled at her discipline, how she never fidgeted, how she kept her eyes lowered at the right moments, how she moved with dignity beyond her years. For the English nobility, the sight was both reassuring and unsettling. On one hand, Isabella was a visible promise of peace with France. Her very presence symbolized stability. On the other hand, she was a constant reminder of how fragile that peace was, how it rested on the shoulders of a child who could neither rule nor defend herself. The coronation feast stretched for 3 days, filled with jugglers, musicians, and elaborate performances meant to symbolize the glorious future ahead. At the high table, Isabella sat beside Richard, carefully mimicking the manners drilled into her by her French tutors. She picked at her food, smiled when prompted, and endured the weight of countless stares. To the crowd, she was a queen. To herself, she was still a girl, overwhelmed by the enormity of her role. As the feasting continued and the city roared with celebration, Isabella's future began to take shape. From that day forward, she was no longer the daughter of a troubled French king. She was the Queen of England, watched, measured, and judged by all, her childhood exchanged for the fragile promise of peace. After the glitter and noise of her coronation, Isabella settled into a new life within the walls of Westminster Palace. To the world, she was Queen of England, but behind the guarded doors of her apartments, she was still a little girl, learning how to walk through a labyrinth of rituals and politics she could barely comprehend. Richard II, her husband in name but more a guardian in truth, took a surprising interest in her upbringing. Perhaps he saw in her the daughter he had never fathered, or perhaps he viewed her as a fragile bridge to peace that needed careful tending. Whatever the reason, the king visited her chambers often, bringing gifts meant not to dazzle but to delight a child. A gilded psalter with bright illustrations of saints and kings, a cage of exotic birds from Ireland, and fine books crafted in Oxford, their pages painted with blue and gold. When he spoke to her, his tone was gentle, almost protective, as though he wanted her to forget that the crown on her head was heavier than any jewel. Isabella responded to these gestures with cautious affection. She greeted Richard with the formality expected of a queen, curtsying with practiced grace, but her wide eyes betrayed the relief of seeing a familiar face in a court that often felt alien. Slowly, she grew less afraid. She began to practice her English phrases with pride, smiling when Richard praised her progress. Her household was carefully constructed to blend both French and English influences. French ladies-in-waiting whispered to her in her mother tongue, preserving ties to home, while English attendants taught her the customs of her new country, how to curtsy properly to the great lords, how to prefer wine over ale, and how to carry herself with the dignity expected of England's queen. Most important of all were her companions among the children of the court. Nobles sent their sons and daughters to be raised in proximity to the crown, and it was within this circle that Isabella found friendship. Margaret Holland, just a few years older, became her closest confidant. Margaret taught her English songs and games, but also warned her, with the wisdom of a child forced to grow up too soon, about the dangerous currents that swirled beneath the glittering surface of court life. "Watch their faces," Margaret whispered once in the garden, "for they will not speak their true thoughts aloud." Isabella listened, and she learned. Her days soon filled with lessons. Tutors instructed her in reading and writing, in both French and English. Master William, a clerk of the realm, spread maps across the floor, teaching her how the narrow waters between Dover and Calais had been bridge and barrier alike for centuries. At only 8 years old, Isabella began to understand that her very life was now a symbol, a fragile hope that the sea between two kingdoms could finally serve as a link rather than a divide. For the first time since leaving France, she began to feel something close to belonging. The palace no longer seemed a prison, but a place where she could grow. Yet even in these fleeting moments of comfort, shadows lingered. Peace, she would soon learn, was as fragile as the crown balanced on her small head. For a brief span of years, England seemed calmer than it had in decades. From 1397 to 1398, the kingdom enjoyed an uneasy but precious peace, its people weary of war and cautiously hopeful that the child queen's presence signaled a new beginning. Within the walls of Westminster, Isabella grew into her role with surprising poise. No longer the trembling girl carried into London for her coronation, she was now a more confident child of 8 and 9. Her English improved rapidly, and she spoke it with the accent of the court, to the delight of her tutors. Nobles who had once scoffed at the idea of a 6-year-old queen began to remark on her dignity, her quick wit, and her keen observations. To many, Isabella was more than a symbol of peace. She was a promise that perhaps this fragile truce might hold. Richard II encouraged her education with paternal devotion. He visited often, correcting her pronunciation, sharing stories from chronicles of English kings, and presenting her with gifts from across his realm. Isabella began to look forward to his visits, greeting him with a mixture of reverence and warmth. To Richard, she was no mere pawn, but a child entrusted to his care, and in her presence he seemed to soften, as though the crown's burdens briefly lifted. Isabella's companions at court, especially Margaret Holland, helped her navigate the subtle hierarchies that governed palace life. The girls played together in gardens and practiced embroidery, but even in their games, politics intruded. Margaret explained which lords were loyal, which ones whispered behind the king's back, and which families nursed grudges that stretched back generations. Isabella listened intently. She absorbed the atmosphere of suspicion that hung over court life, learning far earlier than most children that smiles often concealed daggers. Beyond the palace walls, England exhaled after years of conflict. Villages scarred by raids began to rebuild. Merchants returned to markets. Peasants tilled their fields without fear of soldiers marching through. The 28-year truce with France had given the kingdom a reprieve, and ordinary people credited the child queen for it. Though she was too young to grasp the weight of their gratitude, Isabella became a figure of hope, carried in songs and prayers across the land. Yet beneath this surface calm, fault lines widened. Many of Richard's nobles resented the peace with France, believing the king too willing to negotiate rather than conquer. They muttered that he favored courtiers over lords, and that his judgment was clouded by pride and extravagance. These whispers rarely reached Isabella directly, but she sensed the unease in hushed conversations that stopped when she entered a room or in the watchful eyes of servants who lingered longer than necessary. For Isabella, these years were her happiest in England. She grew stronger, brighter, and more confident, unaware that the fragile peace she embodied was already cracking beneath her feet. Soon the laughter of gardens and the comfort of lessons would be drowned out by the roar of rebellion. By the spring of 1399, the calm that had cradled Isabella's early years in England began to unravel. The corridors of Westminster grew tense with whispers, and the smiles of courtiers tightened into masks. Even as lessons continued and gardens bloomed with summer flowers, the child queen sensed something shifting. Conversation stopped abruptly when she entered. Her ladies exchanged nervous glances. Margaret Holland, usually so full of confidence, seemed distracted and uneasy. The cause of this unrest was no secret to Richard II. His cousin, Henry Bolingbroke, whom he had exiled only the year before, had returned to England with an army. Officially, Henry claimed he sought only to reclaim his inheritance, but in truth, he aimed at something far greater, the crown itself. Many of England's great lords, weary of Richard's heavy hand and extravagant court, began to rally to Henry's banner. The fragile peace that Isabella embodied was about to collapse under the weight of ambition. Isabella first felt the tremors of the crisis when, one morning, several of her English attendants vanished from her chambers without warning. Their places were quietly taken by guards and grim-faced servants. Later that same day, Richard himself appeared, his once regal presence now ragged, his eyes shadowed with worry. He knelt before the 9-year-old queen just as he had on the day of their wedding, but this time his voice trembled. "My dear child," he said, "our circumstances have grown difficult. There are men who question my right to rule. They will come for me, and perhaps for you." Isabella, wiser than her years, asked directly, "Are you still king?" Richard forced a smile, bitter and fleeting. "For now." That evening, Isabella was hurried out of Westminster under the cover of darkness. Her litter rattled through the narrow streets of London, escorted not by cheering crowds but by grim soldiers. She heard angry shouts in the distance, the clatter of boots, the tension of a city bracing for upheaval. When the convoy finally stopped, she found herself at the Tower of London, a place of safety and of prison, depending on the whims of those who held power. Inside the tower, Isabella's world shrank. The barred windows and guarded doors made clear her new reality. She was not just England's queen. She was a prize, an asset to be bargained, leveraged, or discarded as events demanded. Her French ladies tried to reassure her, but their whispers carried their own fear. In the following weeks, Henry's power swelled as Richard's support withered. Nobles defected, armies deserted, and the crown that had seemed so secure was ripped away with stunning speed. For Isabella, the palace that once felt like a home had vanished forever. She was 9 years old. But already she understood a truth that most children were spared. Crowns were not shields, and titles were no protection. In the ruthless game of kings, she was once again reduced to what she had been since birth, an innocent child forced to bear the weight of other men's ambitions. The tide turned swiftly. By late summer of 1399, Henry Bolingbroke marched into London as a conqueror, while Richard II, abandoned by many of his lords, was left powerless. The once proud king, who had paraded his young queen as a symbol of peace, was now a prisoner in his own realm. For Isabella, confined within the tower, the news came in fragments, hushed voices, scraps of conversation between guards, rumors whispered by her French ladies. She knew only that Richard visited her less often, and when he did, his face bore the weight of despair. The confidence that had once steadied her was gone. His hair was unkempt, his robes rumpled, his eyes wild with sleeplessness. One evening, he entered her chamber and knelt before her chair, just as he had done the day they first met. But this time his words were not vows of protection, they were warnings. "My child," he said softly, "there are those who will take this crown from me. I cannot promise that I will keep you safe. You must remember, you are more than a pawn. You are a queen. Do not let them make you forget that." Isabella, only 9 years old, felt the full weight of his sorrow. She asked him plainly, "Will they kill you?" Richard did not answer. He only touched her hand, then rose and left. Not long after, Richard was taken north to Pontefract Castle. In October, Henry forced him to abdicate, seizing the throne as Henry IV. To justify his usurpation, Henry insisted Richard had willingly surrendered the crown. But in truth, it was the brutal arithmetic of politics. The king had lost, and losers in such games rarely lived long. By February of 1400, word reached London that Richard was dead. The official account claimed he had starved himself, wasting away in captivity. Others whispered he had been murdered on Henry's orders, quietly suffocated, or struck down in secret. Whatever the truth, his body was displayed in St. Paul's Cathedral, his face left uncovered to silence rumors of survival. For Isabella, the news was a blow she could not put into words. She had never loved Richard as a wife could. She was far too young, but he had been her protector, her teacher, and in many ways the closest thing to a father she had known since leaving France. His death was not only a personal loss, it was the collapse of the fragile shelter that had shielded her in a hostile land. Now she was truly alone, a child queen without a king, a widow at the age of 10. The court that had once bowed before her now looked upon her as a problem to be solved, a piece of France trapped in England, valuable to some, inconvenient to others. And as Henry IV settled onto the throne, Isabella's fate hung uncertain, balanced precariously between diplomacy and danger. The heavy doors of Isabella's chamber creaked open, and for the first time since Richard's death, she came face to face with the man who now called himself King of England. Henry Bolingbroke, Henry IV, stepped inside with the bearing of a soldier rather than the grace of a courtly king. His armor clinked softly beneath a cloak of crimson, and his eyes, sharp and calculating, studied the young queen like a prize to be appraised. Isabella rose from her chair, her small figure draped in French silks, and curtsied as she had been taught. Every instinct told her to bow low to show deference. Yet she did not tremble. She held her head with the dignity Richard had once urged her to keep, the dignity of a queen, even in captivity. Henry inclined his head slightly as though acknowledging her courage. "Your Grace," he said, choosing not to strip her of her title, "I regret that circumstances require us to meet under such conditions." The words were polite, But Isabella heard the steel beneath them. This man was not here to comfort her. He was here to decide her fate. "What has become of the king?" Isabella asked, her voice steady though her heart raced. Henry's lips tightened. "Richard of Bordeaux is no longer king. He has abdicated in my favor." The careful phrasing could not disguise the truth. Richard had been forced out, and likely worse. Isabella, though still a child, understood enough of politics to hear what went unsaid. She asked no further questions about Richard. Instead, she asked the only one that mattered. "What becomes of me?" The silence that followed seemed to stretch across the chamber. Henry's gaze lingered on her, weighing options. To him, Isabella was no child. She was leverage. As Richard's widow, she was still legally Queen of England. As the daughter of Charles VI of France, she was a living treaty. To send her back would risk offending her father and perhaps reigniting war. To keep her might buy him time, but at what cost? At last, Henry spoke. "That depends on many things. On your father's response to recent events, on the counsel I receive, and, perhaps most of all, on your conduct in the months to come." It was a warning wrapped in diplomacy. Isabella understood. If she rebelled, if she clung too fiercely to her title, she could be silenced. But if she carried herself with grace, she might preserve not only her life, but her value. In the days that followed, she played her part with astonishing skill. She was polite, never openly defiant, but she never allowed herself to be diminished. She ate little, spoke only when addressed, and maintained the dignity of a queen, even in isolation. To her attendants, she whispered only one reminder: "I am still Queen of England." Henry may have stolen the crown, but Isabella refused to let him strip her of her identity. In that defiance, quiet and unwavering, lay the first sparks of the resilience that would define the rest of her short, tragic life. By the year 1401, Isabella's life in England had become a quiet cage. Confined within the Tower, she lived in apartments that were comfortable enough, but lined with barred windows and watched by guards at every doorway. Though treated with outward respect, she was no longer a queen in truth. She was a bargaining chip, a living hostage whose very presence tethered England to the fragile peace her marriage had once promised. For months, her fate was debated in council chambers. Some of Henry IV's advisors urged that she remain in England. As long as Isabella was in his custody, France would hesitate to provoke war. Others pressed for her return, arguing that the cost of maintaining her household was wasteful, and that sending her home under Henry's terms would assert his dominance. Meanwhile, Isabella herself endured with remarkable composure. At only 10 years old, she carried herself with the gravity of a woman 3 times her age. She dressed each day in her French silks, spoke politely to her captors, and never let her dignity falter. To her attendants she whispered, "As long as I am Richard's widow, I am still Queen of England." The stalemate ended when pressure came from across the Channel. King Charles VI, during one of his fleeting moments of lucidity, demanded the return of his daughter. For France, Isabella's captivity was an insult, a visible scar of Richard's fall. Renewed war loomed if she was not released. Faced with the threat, Henry IV relented. Isabella would be sent home, but not before she was forced to sign away her rights, an acknowledgement that she no longer claimed the English crown, that her years as Richard's queen were erased like chalk from a slate. For Isabella, it was a bitter humiliation. Though only a child, she understood that this was more than a dismissal. It was the deliberate stripping of her place in history, and yet she signed. She signed because to refuse was to risk remaining a prisoner forever. The journey back to France was both a relief and a sorrow. As her litter carried her through the gates of London, she passed streets once lined with cheering crowds at her coronation. Now the people looked on in silence, watching a 10-year-old widow return to her homeland, her crown left behind. She crossed the Channel not as a queen triumphant, but as a girl who had tasted both the splendor and the cruelty of monarchy. When she arrived in Paris, the Louvre no longer felt like the home she remembered. She now spoke French with an English accent, preferred English fashions, and carried with her memories that set her apart from the siblings she had left behind. The child who had departed at 6 returned at 11 as someone transformed, older in spirit, sharper in understanding, and already scarred by betrayal. Isabella had lost her crown, her husband, and her childhood. But what she carried back across the Channel was something far more enduring: resilience. That strength would shape the next chapter of her life, when France once again turned her into a pawn on the chessboard of power. When Isabella stepped once more into the Louvre in 1401, she was not greeted as a daughter returning home, but as a stranger who carried the shadow of England with her. She was only 11, yet her years abroad had marked her. Her French now carried the faint lilt of an English accent, and she instinctively curtsied with the precision of the English court rather than the looser gestures of Paris. The courtiers noticed. Some whispered admiration at her poise. Others whispered suspicion. Her father, Charles VI, was deep in one of his terrifying spells of madness when she returned. He failed even to recognize her at first, staring through her as though she were a ghost wandering his palace. Weeks later, during a rare, lucid moment, he welcomed her back with tears and gifts. But by then, Isabella understood the truth. Her father could not protect her. Her mother, Isabel of Bavaria, offered a warmer reception, but her gaze was calculating. To her, Isabella was not merely a daughter reclaimed, but a political asset reshaped by 5 years in England. She pressed her with questions about Henry IV's court, about the loyalty of English nobles, about Richard's final days. Isabella answered cautiously, careful to give enough to satisfy her mother's curiosity, while withholding details that might betray the memory of the husband who had once been her protector. At court, her position was precarious. Some nobles viewed her as a symbol of humiliation, proof that France had bartered its princess to a foreign king, only to see him dethroned and her crown stripped away. Others saw opportunity. As the widow of England's last Plantagenet king, she carried a unique legitimacy that could be wielded in diplomacy. Whispers arose. Might Isabella one day be remarried into another royal house, her status once again used as currency in the endless games of power? Isabella herself struggled with conflicting loyalties. France was her homeland, yet England had shaped her childhood. She thought often of Richard, of the kindness he had shown her, and of the fragile peace he had tried to preserve. When French nobles spoke with venom about their enemies across the Channel, Isabella's silence was noticeable. She did not defend England, but neither did she condemn it with the fury expected of her. To some, her restraint was wisdom. To others, it was betrayal. Despite her isolation, Isabella grew into a thoughtful young woman. She immersed herself in study, in music, in letters, sharpening her mind and cultivating the quiet resilience that had been forged in captivity. Where other girls her age might still have played with dolls, Isabella carried herself with the composure of a widow and the insight of someone who had seen 2 kingdoms from within. At just 11 years old, she had been both queen and prisoner, both child and political token. Now, in the shifting factions of the French court, she stood on the threshold of another transformation. France had reclaimed its daughter, but in Isabella's eyes lingered a truth no courtier could ignore. She was no longer the innocent girl who had once left Paris. She had returned tempered, unyielding, and prepared to face whatever new role fate demanded of her. By 1406, Isabella had learned that crowns could be cages, and treaties could be cages too. Yet when talk arose of a second marriage, the whisper carried a different tone, less like a command, more like a possibility. The suitor was Charles of Orleans, a prince of royal blood, and even in youth, a boy with the soul of a poet. He was thoughtful rather than brash, reflective rather than loud, a mirror held up against the turbulence that had defined Isabella's childhood. The match made sense to the counselors. Politically, it strengthened the Valois line and anchored Orleans loyalty within a court split by rival factions. Personally, it offered a gentler fate for a young widow who had already played queen and prisoner before her 11th year. For once, calculation and kindness seemed to point in the same direction. The wedding took place in Paris, with pageantry carefully measured, not the thunderous spectacle of a truce between enemies, but a more intimate ceremony that spoke of restoration rather than conquest. Isabella entered the chapel robed in white and cloth of gold. The candles multiplied her image along the polished stone like a line of guardians. Charles stood waiting, not towering over her as Richard once had, but beside her, almost shy, as though he feared to break something delicate. When their hands met, there was no tremor of dread in hers, only a new kind of uncertainty, the kind that attends hope. If Richard had treated her as a daughter to be shielded, Charles treated her as a companion to be heard. He asked about England without prying, asked about her studies without condescension. In the quiet hours after ceremonies and salutes, they walked the galleries where tapestries showed battles neither wished to fight. Charles spoke of verses he admired, of new meters brought from Italy, of the way language could carry sorrow without spilling it. Isabella listened, not as a child memorizing a lesson, but as a woman recognizing another mind reaching for her own. Court life did not soften merely because the couple was gentle. France still seethed under the strain of the king's illness. Factions jostled like tides in a narrow harbor. The Orleans and Burgundian parties sharpened their knives in salons scented with amber and wine. Isabella knew the scent of danger when she breathed it. She carried herself with the same unshakable poise she had worn in the Tower, but now it was tempered by choice rather than compulsion. No one needed to remind her she was valuable. She had learned to be formidable without raising her voice. She found causes to tend, the education of girls of noble birth, alms for the poor who lined the bridges, patronage for scribes who copied books with patience and devotion. In this, Charles followed her lead, and together they became a small hearth of warmth in a palace that often felt cold. The courtiers noticed. Some scoffed at their quiet piety. Others, weary of intrigue, drew near to that flame. At night, when the corridors hushed and the tapestries ceased their whisper, Charles sometimes read to her. He would try a new stanza, pause, and ask, "Is it too heavy?" Isabella would tilt her head, consider, and answer, "Let it breathe." Between them grew a language of small corrections and careful trust. It was not the thunderstrike of romance sung by minstrels, but something steadier, two survivors building a bridge from ash and patience. Outside their apartments, the world still measured her worth in treaties and bloodlines. Inside, she began, at last, to be herself, no longer merely the child queen sent to buy peace, but a young woman learning how to make it. And, for a time, that was enough. A hand she chose to hold, a voice that asked rather than ordered, and a future that, if not certain, was finally her own to imagine. Marriage gave Isabella something England had denied her, a private life that could also shape the public one. Within a year, the palace learned new sounds, the hush of nurses at dawn, the soft astonishment of a baby's first cry. Jane was born first, a small bundle swaddled in white and gold, her arrival greeted not with trumpets, but with tears of relief. Court poets praised the child as a living vow that peace might yet outlast politics. Isabella, who had once been paraded as peace incarnate, now held peace in her arms. Motherhood steadied her. The girl who had crossed the channel as a symbol became a woman organizing rooms, calendars, and lives. She kept lists in a neat hand, which villages needed grain after a flood, which tenants required remittance, which chapels lacked candles, which widows had no winter fuel. To stewards she spoke gently, but with an authority that brooked no delay. She signed letters with a firm, elegant script, the ink drying into a promise. I have seen how neglect breeds rebellion. Tend to the smallest fires before they become a blaze. Charles, for his part, found in fatherhood a new timbre. He still wrote verses, but they were no longer only about lost glories and distant stars. They bent toward the immediate, the curve of an infant's fist, the courage it took for Isabella to laugh after nights of broken sleep. When their second child came, a son whose crib filled the nursery with a steadier kind of hope, Charles kissed Isabella's brow and whispered, "We are building something the sword cannot take." Outside the nursery, France tilted and groaned. Factions pressed against each other, the old quarrels between great houses sharpening in salons and council chambers. Isabella read the currents as if they were written on the Seine. She hosted suppers where enemies sat at opposite ends of the table and left a little less certain of their hatred. She funded copyists and choirs, not as ornaments, but as quiet fortifications, beauty that gathered loyalties no edict could command. Between births, she toured estates with a small retinue, her veil lifting in the wind as she listened to petitions. A miller who had lost a wheel to winter ice received timber and forgiveness. A priest whose roof leaked was granted tiles and men. An orphan girl was set in service with a dowry put aside for her future. Isabella remembered what it felt like to be powerless and made a habit of preventing it in others. When their third child arrived, the palace bells rang long and bright. Isabella smiled through exhaustion, the room fragrant with beeswax and lavender. She had always known that crowns were heavy. Now she knew that love was heavier still and infinitely worth the weight. In the brief stillness between lullabies and letters, she allowed herself a rare confidence. Perhaps life, at last, was choosing her back. The promise of a quiet life did not survive the winter of 1407. News cleaved the court like an axe. Louis, Duke of Orléans, Charles' father and the king's brother, had been murdered on a Paris street, cut down by men loyal to the Duke of Burgundy. The city went suddenly colder. Torches seemed to smoke rather than burn. Every corridor carried the hiss of factional whispers. Isabella felt the temperature of France change in a single night. Grief hardened Charles from poet to heir. Titles and estates flowed to him with the same weight as expectation. Courtiers crowded their chambers with condolences that sounded like calculations. In the hush, after the door closed each evening, Isabella pressed his hand and said the only true thing left: "We will not let this grief decide us." It was not a vow to forgive, only a refusal to be consumed. Politics did not wait. Burgundy and Orléans sorted friends from enemies. Neutral ground shrank to the width of a blade. Isabella answered with the tools she trusted: order, mercy, and presence. She kept the household exact, supplies tallied, petitions heard, stewards rotated so no single hand could clutch too much. She convened small suppers where men who would not speak in council found a way to speak across bread and wine. Peace did not bloom, but hatred paused to listen. Amid this gathering storm, Isabella quickened with child. The palace, for once, learned again the language of hope, the measured steps of midwives, the careful talk of names. She wrote to churches along the Loire, asking for prayers. Charles, who had learned to lace sorrow to syllables, wrote no elegies that spring. He spoke instead of cradles and mournings. In 1409, their daughter Joan was born. The bell that announced her arrival seemed to ring longer than any before. Isabella wept, not the ceremonial tears of a queen, but the private tears of a woman whose arms, at last, were full. She kissed the child's brow, marveled at the impossible smallness of fingers that could still grasp a father's thumb and a nation's hope at once. But the same year that gave her a child took her strength. Fever followed the birth, a fire that no prayer could lower. Physicians came and went, exchanging glances Isabella had already learned to read. She asked for letters to be brought, accounts from estates, lists of the poor to be fed. She corrected figures with a steady hand until the ink began to blur. When the pain grew mean, she asked that Jean be laid beside her. "Let her learn," Isabella whispered, "that the first thing a crown should do is shelter." Charles sat at the bed's edge through nights that forgot to end. He tried to read her a few newly mended lines, but the words broke in his mouth. Isabella smiled anyway, that slight, composed smile that had steadied men twice her age. "Let it breathe," she said. One last edit, a grace she returned to him even then. When the fever finally ebbed, it did not leave her behind. Isabella died in 1409, scarcely 19, with her daughter sleeping in a cradle and the world still arguing outside the door, the court dressed in mourning. Factions paused only long enough to count which way grief might tilt advantage. They laid her to rest with the care she had given to ledgers and lives. Precise without excess, candles trimmed, alms distributed to those who would never know her name. And if the bells sounded different that day, it was because a kind of peace had gone out of the room. The quiet, deliberate peace of a woman who had learned to hold chaos in small human hands. History often remembers the loudest men in the room. It writes their names on banners, hammers their faces into coins, and lets their victories or cruelties stand for an age. Isabella of Valois left no battlefield tales, no iron decrees, no children who would one day wear a crown. And yet, when the noise fades, her life leaves a quieter proof that power is not only what one commands, but what one protects. Her legacy begins with what she endured. As a child, she was yoked to a treaty. As a queen, she was turned into a hostage. As a widow, she was measured, priced, and nearly forgotten. But within those confines, she practiced a different craft of state. She made rooms safer than she found them. She learned how to steady frightened servants, how to read the temperature of a court before it burst into flame, how to place people at a table so that enemies could sit without drawing knives. In a century that worshipped force, she practiced maintenance, the hard, humble work of keeping things from breaking. It is easy to dismiss such work because it does not announce itself. Isabella never ruled a council with a fist. She never issued a proclamation that rattled a border. Instead, she mended. She saw that small mercies, grain sent to a flooded village, a leaking roof repaired, a dowry set aside for an orphan, could do what war never learned to do: buy time, soften hearts, create the conditions where larger goods might survive. This, too, is governance. This, too, is statecraft. Her marriage to Charles d'Orléans offered a second lesson, that tenderness can be political. Not sentimental, not naive, political. By insisting that the private realm be ordered with fairness and care, she pushed back against the casual brutality that seeped from council chambers into homes. In rooms scented with beeswax and lavender, she taught that a crown should shelter first. The phrase outlived her. It became the note Charles tuned himself to as grief and danger crowded his door, and it became a measure by which courtiers judged themselves, even if only in secret. Isabella's daughter Jeanne would carry a piece of that inheritance onward, the knowledge that a woman's hands could bind a world that swords had torn. And if later generations remembered Charles for his verses, it is not hard to hear in them the echo of the counsel Isabella gave. Let it breathe, space for mercy, space for thought, space for a future not shaped only by the last blow struck. Her story also indicts an old habit of history, to number women among the scenery, while men move the plot. Isabella was not scenery. She was the cost of treaties and the proof of their failure, the promise of peace, and the measure of what peace demanded from those least able to refuse. To tell her life straight is to admit that the great affairs of state were built again and again on the backs of children asked to be braver than the adults who used them. So what remains after the bells? A small creed, simple enough to write in a margin and stern enough to govern a life. Make the room safer. Keep the ledger honest. Guard the weak first. If you do it well, no song will be written about you, but the world will break a little less. That is Isabella's legacy, not the weight of a crown, but the weight of a hand placed steadily where the world begins to crack.